Hello and welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst, and there are, yes, exactly 2 weeks left. Are you exhausted, overwhelmed by all the news, and at the same time finding it repetitive and at times actually boring? Deja vu all over again? Trump trashes reality. Biden hunkers down in Delaware. The virus surges again to astronomical, historic levels. Even the idea of another debate, which is coming on Thursday, seems somehow anticlimactic. I mean, I live for elections and I am bored. So honestly, I'm bored of the pain, bored of the crises. So honestly, this is tough. I, for one, am going stir crazy. If you feel overwhelmed by too much happening, it is because too much is happening. That's how history feels when you are living in it, when you are working through it. So I need to say this. if we lose our focus in these last 2 weeks, we will regret it for years. Progressives are closer than we have been in decades, century, perhaps, to the kind of political upheaval that will, and I hate to say it this way, open the door to our goals. This is why we can't give up. That's why this matters right now. That is what matters at this moment. It does help to remember that a lot of what is going on actually doesn't matter very much or is intentionally meant to distract from what does matter. Trump trashes another CNN correspondent, whatever. Trump says for the umpteenth time he may not accept the election. Pay attention to that, because that is what this is about. Fascism doesn't always roll into town on a column of tanks. Sometimes it bores you into apathy with numbing repetition. The news cycle is not a measure of what matters. We know that. Trump gets away with things by saying them so many times at the media, and then the rest of us stop listening. Overturning the election is as big of a threat today as it was the first time he said it. And as we've discussed, the response should be a vote so massive that Trump can't fight it. In the chaos and distractions, there are other things that really matter. Amy Coney Barrett, remember her? Oh yeah, the sixth right-wing vote for the Supreme Court. Stopping her confirmation in the Senate is a long shot, but we have to try. We aren't afraid of long shots. Progressivism was a long shot until the day we started winning. Senator Chuck Schumer tried yesterday, because of us, by the way, of our voices, to prevent her confirmation before the election. He moved to adjourn the Senate until after the election, and then he lost. The Republicans are barreling ahead to confirm her by early next week. It's despicable. But the Republicans don't care what we think. They only care if we have the power to stop them. Which brings us to something else, the Senate. Oh, I know the Senate is a bastion of status quo thinking, a sump tank of corporate money. We know this. I haven't even mentioned, of course, Senator Kamala Harris and what I think of her, but Amy Coney Barrett sums up the difference between a Republican-controlled Senate and the Democratic-run Senate we could have after the election. If a Republican Senate, we will, in that Republican Senate that we have right now, and even with a presidency, we will fight defensive actions every day just to protect abortion rights, same-sex marriage, the Affordable Care Act, and a livable planet. In a Democratic Senate, as angry as some of them will make us, we can fight every day for real Medicare for all, a livable wage, perhaps reflective of the needs of a human being, fair housing, the Green New Deal, and a real hearty response to this COVID crisis and the economic disaster that's a result of it. This is through our existing progressive senators in the Senate and pressuring the young opportunistic senators who need progressives to win. I am looking at you, Corey. I am looking at you, Senator Sinema. There is a real difference, and that difference, it's on the ballot right now. So we have to hang in there. As activists we have to find the image that motivates us. Finish strong, play through the buzzer, run through the tape. It ain't over until the fat lady sings or the fat man cries. After all this, we will need a detox. Just hopefully not drinking Clorox. We have a wonderful show today. We have Derek Black here to discuss education, and later Geovanny, Alcibia, and Napoleon DeLegend on to talk about voting and some of the stuff that's up right now. But first, here is what is at the top of my newsfeed. A recent interview from NPR with journalist Tessa Stewart reveals how the Trump presidency has impacted U.S. immigration with its harsh exclusionary policies. Stewart makes the case that a Biden presidency will defend DACA and end travel bans and family separations. That was, of course, a previous policy of the Obama administration. So that's actually something to pay attention to. What policies does Biden have no choice to turn around on? Because Trump has taken Obama policies and made them so much worse. He will reverse, there are several policies, including education, which we'll talk about later. He could reverse that were Obama policies. So this reporter, Stewart, takes a look at an uptick in technical changes as well as, quote, big sweeping changes, end quote, to understand not only how Trump has ramped up ICE raids countrywide, but also how he has used policy and executive actions to structurally change the way immigration works in the United States. It means, of course, that we need to vote Trump out of office, but also that advocacy for immigration rights won't end simply because a new president has been installed. We need to comprehensively understand the policy changes that Trump has made to build a lasting system of cruelty for people immigrating to the United States. And as leftists, we need to organize around dismantling the entire policy system. We had amazing news today, this weekend, out of Bolivia. The presidential election was won by the socialist candidate Luis Arce. The party, of course, was the former party to President Evo Morales, it's which he belongs to, the former president who was ousted. After lifting millions of people out of extreme poverty, and nationalizing major industries, Morales was forced out of office by a coup that installed the theocratic conservative Jeanine Áñez. They deemed that election to a fourth term illegitimate for no discernible reason. We know this history, and a review of the U.S.'s opposition to Bolivia's nationalization of its natural resources, looking at you, Elon Musk, will give you a pretty good idea why. But there is no doubt Evo had the people's support then, and with 52.4% of the vote, the socialists have it now. Indigenous women leaders and allied signatories wrote a letter to several of the world's major financial institutions demanding an end to extractive pipeline projects and the tar sands sector. Major authors of the letter include Rebecca Adamson, Cherokee and founder of the First Nations and First Peoples Worldwide; Tara Hauska, friend of the show, friend of Matriarch, advisor, she's the founder of, I'm going to mess this up, I'm not even going to say it, Couchiching First Nation. She's an attorney as well. Winona LaDuke, one of the most well-known Native Indigenous activists, White Earth Nation, and executive director of Honor the Earth. Those are just a few of the names. The letter draws a direct tie between Indigenous rights and climate justice, arguing the destructive practices like those of the tar sands and pipeline sectors have threatened the safety of Indigenous women, brought about elevated COVID-19 threats during construction, and grievously harmed the planet. The leaders demand the replacement of these exploitative industries with a just transition to clean energy. Further proof that a Green New Deal is in the best interest of cultural, social, and environmental survival. All right, up next, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to be talking about education, what's at stake right now at this moment, even under Trump, but also what could potentially be at stake under a Biden presidency. That is going to be just after the break.
Hello, we good on the sound?
Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst. Education is a topic that is mobilizing the country right now. In red states, there are propositions on the ballot to fund public education. The public education system has been in crisis for decades, and Democrats have had a big part in that. I am very excited to have our next guest on. He is a professor of law at the University of South Carolina, and he is the author of Schoolhouse Burning. It's like I can't even read. I don't have my glasses on right now. It's really killing me. The lights are killing me. Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education, and the Assault on American Democracy, which explains the threat that current trends pose, not just to public education, but to democracy itself. Derek Black, thank you for joining us. I think we can unmute you now, right? Good on that end? Oh. Zoom does not allow us to do it for you. You have to do it for yourself.
Well, I think I did it, and then you hit it at the same time, and it muted me back. But yeah, thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. So I want to start off with just the state of education politically right now, and then work backwards if that works.
Sure.
I say this because Arizona, for instance, has a proposal on its ballot right now, proposition to increase funding for education. It's in a right-to-work state. It's one of these red states where public school teachers have mobilized. Of course, during the pandemic, their case just is much, much stronger. So what does it look like right now, the state of public education?
Well, I think you laid it out well to begin with, was simply to say, public education got hammered really hard following the 2008 recession. And in about half of our states, the levels of school funding before the current pandemic, right, were still below their pre-recession levels of 2008. So we still had not made up the last recession. And so a lot of those states, they're now getting hit with a double dip, right? They weren't where they needed to be before, and now they're cut even further. And you mentioned Arizona. Arizona was declared ground zero in the fight to privatize education by the Koch brothers and other organizations of that sort. And they have been hammering and hammering and hammering. The bright spot, as you point out, is that, teachers, and not just teachers, parents and students are pushing back with them. And so, we've seen tens of thousands of people take to the streets in 2018 and 2019. That's been a little bit more difficult in 2020. But, there's a lot of regular folks that are upset about what they see happening in their state houses.
So just looking back on this process, okay, so here we are in 2020, excuse me, I don't even know what year it is. We're in 2020. Betsy DeVos is our education secretary. Clearly, she's a big part of the charter school push across America. But that obviously didn't start with her. George W. Bush was a big part of this, but Obama, of course, was very friendly to charter schools. And I guess I'm looking at it from the perspective of how are we going to get out of this when you have somebody leading the Democratic ticket right now who is a product of a White House that pushed for a lot of the measures that kept the charter school movement going.
Yeah, I think that you sort of hit the nail on the head. And just to give listeners just a little bit of background, charter schools had been capped in a lot of states. So North Carolina, for instance, had said 100 charter schools in the state of North Carolina, no more, which is to say maximum one per school district across the state. But, during the last recession, Secretary Duncan said that, these applications for new federal funds will be jeopardized by any state who places an artificial cap on charter schools. So, in a moment of financial distress, a lot of states eliminated those caps, and you saw, go from having 1 million students in charter schools to 3 million students in charter schools. So enormous expansion. You are expressing a fear that a lot of folks have expressed, which is, well, if that's the last administration, is just going to be more of the same. I don't know. There's a lot we don't know about Joe Biden, to be quite honest. And I don't mean that in a bad or a good way, right? That if you wanted to look at the most detailed progressive plan out there, that would have been Elizabeth Warren's. And by full disclosure, the campaign reached out to me, and I gave them what they needed to come up with a funding plan to fix America's schools. Joe, lot vaguer on the points there, and so. But I will say, the Network for Public Education had a convening in Pittsburgh last November, maybe it was December, where all of the Democratic candidates showed up, And, there was a real show of force by public education advocates. And, he talked the talk then. Now, there were some generalities to it, but he did talk the talk. How that shakes out in real policy, I don't know, because there's ultimately going to be experts that he hires to run his department that are going to move us in one direction or the other. And, I don't know who those people are going to be yet. I've heard names, but I don't know who they're going to be yet.
So, I mean, from my perspective, I just think that politically, he really has no choice. I mean, just same thing with Medicare for All, for instance. Like, these might have been cornerstones of the ACA might have been a cornerstone of the Obama administration, but we're at a different time, and the political pressure is much more sophisticated and organized and frustrated, too. I mean, I have no doubt that the public, Randy Weingarten was promised a ton, and did teachers receive it? No. But even in Democratic states, I mean, this is not just a red state issue. This is not just a North Carolina, Arizona issue. New York, for instance, the charter school movement in New York held up the legislature, arguably, for quite a bit of time. Paid a lot of Democratic senators to go work with Republicans, creating that IDC dilemma, so they could push for more charter schools. And now you see a return to a Democratic legislature that is more public school focused. And I mean, notoriously, like, those New York City schools are underfunded, and now you see what's happening in the midst of this COVID crisis. So can we just rewind? Let's go all the way back. Let's go back to, like, the Koch brothers. Like, how did this all start?
Well, I would say that obviously the Koch brothers don't want to pay any more taxes to support your children or my children. They want their tax bill to be as low as possible, right? Or as Grover Norquist has said, to shrink government to the size that you can drown it in the bathtub, right? And at the federal level, that is health care and Social Security. But at the state level, that's public education, right? Public education consumes the lion's share of all state and local resources. So if you're trying to shrink government to the size that you can drown it in a bathtub, you're talking about kids in public schools, right, at the state level. So I think for that group of folks, this is just about money and small government ideology. I think there's another sort of part of that constituency that is religiously motivated, that have always felt that they're double taxed and that the government is discriminating against them, and they ought to be able to pursue their religious efforts on the public dime. And then there's this third, what I find far more sympathetic part of that constituency, which is also part of the charter school constituency. It is true that we have minority communities across this country that never in the history of the United States have been fully served by their state and local government. And so when you hear, some white guy, even if he went to integrated schools and does race work, saying, hey, believe in the public schools, those public schools haven't served them. And they're ultimately saying, look, we have to have solutions. And I'm sympathetic to that. My argument is not really one against those families in a precarious situation. My argument is that, the enemy is not the public school system. The enemy is the state legislature, who refuses to fund the public school system. And the enemy is the one who's trying to sell you vouchers and charters. So be careful about making a deal with the enemy.
So when you talk about these legislatures that have been pushing for not funding public schools properly, how did that start? Where were you talk about Arizona being ground zero. Was that where they tested it out and then started expanding to other states?
Well, we certainly have ground zero for vouchers being Florida, for instance. I mean, Florida, following the recession, Florida had their first voucher bill declared unconstitutional by the Florida Supreme Court. So they go back to the drawing board and come up with all of these, what we call in the field, neo-vouchers and tax credit systems to try to find workarounds. So you went from a state that was spending somewhere around $30 or $40 million a year on private school tuition to one that is now spending $1 billion a year on private school education, right? And so that's just tremendous. That's ground zero. And then you see other people jumping on the bandwagon. Indiana then enacts a charter school program, a voucher program that was even bigger than the one in Florida. And of course, that's Mike Pence. He was fighting for it. He was pushing for it. Nevada passed one that would have been arguably the largest in the country, that it would have authorized every single student in the state of Nevada to access a voucher for private schools if they chose it. The state Supreme Court struck that down, fortunately. Arizona tried to copy that, and really, because of the advocacy of teachers, were able to push it back and make it smaller. But at least on vouchers, that's sort of the trajectory. On charter schools, New York and California, I think, are about 60 or 70% of the charter schools in the country. So just enormous
Wow.
expansion there. Yeah.
And how were they able to push that through the legislatures in New York and California?
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of Democrats were sold on the idea that charters, right, they were Democrats for Education Reform. It's an organization within the Democratic Party that thought this might be a solution. And I will confess that I slept on the charter school issue, at least in the early years, that I used to talk of them as being an empty vessel, right? They don't have an inherent sort of mission or being. They can be what we want them to be. So if good people are running them, maybe they could be a good thing. What I underestimated is greed and avarice, I guess, that what you see is enormous profit taking, enormous land deals, enormous skimming off the top, falsifying of student data, all of these sorts of things, some of which has landed folks in prison, other of which should land folks in prison, but the laws are actually so favorable that a lot of this scamming is actually legal. That's, I don't have a lot of that in this book, but it's amazing how much of this fleecing of America is actually legal if you do it through a charter school.
I mean, I've read stories when I was reporting on charter schools like a few years ago for TYT. I was shocked to hear stories about charter schools that had shut down and kids who, maybe took a gap year and then wanted to apply to college and couldn't apply to college because they couldn't get the records because the charter schools had shut down.
Well,
Can you imagine that?
Yeah, I mean, I had not heard that story before, but I mean, I think that is at least another example of the difference between public schools and charter schools. I mean, our public schools are there to be there forever for our children. They are a part of the community, and these charters, they don't really have accountability. What I thought you were going to say, which is an equally crazy story, was that when they shut down this chain of charter schools in Ohio because of some graft and corruption, the local community said, well, we want the books, we want the computers, we want the desk. And they said, oh, no. That public money that they use to buy that, all that stuff belongs to them. So if you want it, you got to pay for it a second time. It was a rude awakening to folks to understand that actually public money is being used to buy things that the private individuals then own when they buy it with that public money.
So the idea of charter schools was not it was distorted essentially. It was an idea, a solution for a problem, a temporary problem. Can you explain how charter schools really started to become a weapon and a mechanism for tax, for basically escaping taxes and a tax scheme eventually and a land deal?
Well, so charter schools, as you said, the original idea was that teachers could experiment, right? They could create models that would then teach the public school how to do it better. But not many teachers or well-minded teachers started charter schools, and instead we had folks who wanted to make money, management companies that wanted to skim amounts off the top, et cetera. And so I should say, and there were states that were skeptical of that, right? So North Carolina, again, skeptical of that. Well, we'll experiment with 100, but we're not going to have 1,000 in the state. But as that network of charters began to grow, their lobbying efforts grew far more sophisticated. You mentioned in New York, Illinois, California, where they have full-time lobbyists pushing an agenda, and the reimbursements going up, oversight going down, and it really just became a perfect storm for problems. And to be clear, there are good charter schools out there serving kids. I don't mean to say that, but there's a 70% of them that are doing no better, if not worse, than our public schools, and a huge chunk of them are making money for private investors.
So let's distinguish the good ones versus the bad ones. What are some? I mean, and I understand every state has different designs of charter schools. It's very complicated, right?
Yeah, it is complicated. I mean, I don't know that I've any of our models for charter schools, but what I will point out, for example, is there are charter schools that are diverse by design, right? Mm-hmm. Which is to say our neighborhoods are segregated, the district line is such that our schools are going to stay segregated. So can we create opportunities for families to attend integrated schools in a way that public schools don't? That's a good thing, right? Can we create models where we're going to be having extended learning, right, that may not be able to occur within the school district? That's a good thing, right? And so we do have those out there. But, the bad side of charter schools is really structural, which is, they can pay teachers as little as they want or they can get them for. Students don't have the same due process rights there as they have elsewhere. because of the records that you mentioned, very hard to make sure they're complying with special education and disability laws. And then there's the real estate deals, which is really where the problem comes in, which is that although the charter itself, the entity that receives a charter from the state has to be nonprofit, it can contract with whoever it wants to. And so often what you have, quite frequently, you have a nonprofit that owns the charter, but the same person who's on the board of that nonprofit charter owns all of the companies and all the real estate that runs the school. And 95 to 100% of that money passes through the nonprofit and then is given to a private entity that basically rents land from itself, buys books from itself, buys computers from itself, and pays teachers as little as it can. And that is ultimately the system we have.
And the taxes, there's not only is there a tax break and an incentive, but because it's running through a nonprofit, they also don't have to pay taxes on the other end, right?
Well, there is also, they've also been able to purchase things at lower rates, get better deals. So there's that. It is quite sorted. What I thought you were going to ask, I was going to pivot to, is there's also this other piece from the state, the crowd that wants to shrink government, which is they can cap the amount they're spending on charter schools if they want, and ultimately they are reducing the state's responsibility or the student's financial load. So it's like they're arguably paying less than they should be for a quality education, and the people they're giving it for are actually taking a cut out of the money that's already insufficient in many respects. That's not all of them, right? You do have private foundations that are propping up these charter schools, but the only ones, primarily the only ones that are really doing a bang-up job are ones that are getting a lot of external support beyond just state support. And those, I think are trying to do right by their kids.
Let's talk about the standards. I remember waiting for Superman, the movie that came out in 2009 or 10, somewhere around then. It sounded like a great deal, right?
Well, there are... one of the things I talk about in the book and in my research is that it's really founded on the idea of doing more with less, and partly so you can reap a profit. But, it really relies upon young folks to work at, relatively low wages, work extremely long hours as teachers to try to do something that public schools can't. Well, why? Because they're paying more senior people and they pay them for the hours they work. I mean, how long can you expect to overwork and underpay a group of people and think that system's going to work? So it is a system in many respects that this so-called freedom is really, from some people's perspective, labor exploitation, or at least an unrealistic model. But there's also a tremendous amount of sort of push out that's the problem here. So it's not the same students attending charter schools that attend public schools quite often, right? Because, students who have maybe behavioral issues that the public schools would have to serve, the charter school tries to push out. Early charter schools in California had sweat equity. Now, California has since banned that, but you couldn't attend the school unless your parents donated a certain number of hours to it. Well, again, right, you are filtering out certain students and filtering in others. So there's those problems. And in North Carolina, what we found, ironically, in a system that not integrated, but at least in terms of everyone else, was the most integrated, stable, desegregated state in the history of this country, once Brown versus Board mandated it, charters became the place for white parents to flee. Now, that's not the case in every state, but in North Carolina right now, the public schools are becoming browner at the same moment that the charter schools are becoming whiter. And that tells me that people who do not want to participate in a diverse education environment are dissenting and opting for this quasi-private form of public education at public expense.
It's like discounted private schools for them.
For them, yes, it is. And the story's different everywhere, right? You go to a big city where you've got lots of just terrible charter schools, the ones that you were describing earlier, where they're just barely providing the basics. So it really is a community-to-community issue, but overall, it's a flawed system.
Yeah, you're self-selecting. The teachers are not, at levels that they would be if they were in a union, for instance. But there's also, there's a pressure right now to unionize some of these charter schools too, internally?
Yeah, I think that you've had young folks that got into the business. Maybe they like the school, maybe they like the community, and they realize this is not a sustainable career, right? Or they realize that the expectations are not going to hold up. And so, yes, you do have this movement in some places to try to unionize. whether I think that's going to be to be quite honest, a hard hurdle for them to cross, in part because, as you noted, we can always close a charter school and open another one somewhere else. So I do think it's going to be tough to cross that threshold. But we'll see.
So let's talk about just the map in terms of funding public education right now. I mean, we under Trump or Biden, I mean, it seems like the public opinion is starting to shift, even with Republicans, when it comes to funding public education. It seems like there's the shifting against charter schools and also being more in favor of fully, like they're starting to understand, our public schools are broken because they're not being funded, which is, of course, tied to property taxes. So where do you see this going in the next few months?
Yeah, I mean, well, I talk about this a good deal in the book, which is if you look at in the Southeast United States, ironically, right, they did surveys about a year and a half ago, demographically representative surveys, right? So based upon how many Republicans, how many Democrats, how many independents live in the South race, all of that. And what they found was that only a couple of percentage points separated Democrats from Republicans on these questions that you're raising, right? Is there a problem with inequality? Should schools be fairly funded? Should we, spend more on them? And when I say only a couple of points, I'm talking about, 80 to 85% of Republicans and Democrats saying this is a problem that needs to be solved. Now, you might say, well, if that's the polling, Derek, then why isn't this happening? Well, there has unfortunately been an enormous disconnect between the people who are in the legislature and the people who are voting for us. We've had people who have captured primary victories, primarily in the Republican Party, who have ascended to positions of power and are beholding to relatively narrow groups, right, the sort of Koch-type groups, not to the voters who of both parties want them to do something differently. So I think what we have, or I know what we have, is a log jam. And I'm not a political scientist. I don't know how we undo this log jam, other than to say that it is time for voters to begin to hold their officials responsible. And that means of both parties. I mean, we have lived in a country, never perfect, but you haven't went to the ballot box thinking, well, if I'm a Republican, I'm voting against public education. I mean, this is actually the first election in my life, and arguably the first election in the history of this country, that we have ever had a nominee for the President of the United States who was not pro-public education.
Yeah.
Right? We've had our differences. You mentioned Bush. Hey, No Child Left Behind passed by 90% in the House and the Senate. The Every Student Succeeds Act during the Obama administration, when they could not agree on the time of day, passed at 90%, right, to try to do something for our public schools. This is the first time in history we've had a president or a presidential candidate that doesn't support them. So that means, hey, look, the election's easy for me. And I don't know, what the demographics of all your listeners out there, I can guess. But, so I mean, preaching to the choir, but to your Republican friends out there, if you're listening, those folks, when they go to the poll this fall, this isn't just about taxes. This isn't just about the economy. This isn't just about regulation and foreign affairs. This year, for the first time in your lifetime, this is also about public education. Mm-hmm. So that means that some people who normally vote Republican are going to have to choose between their kids and their taxes, and that's a tough decision to make.
That is a great message. So in terms of how to pay for it, the famous line, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for fully funding our public schools when they're in just such disarray?
Well, I did a debate with the Cato Institute guy, and he was hammering me about this, and I just leaned over and I said, for the cost of a couple of F-18s, that's how. I mean, on one level,
that's right.
Yes, we're talking big money. You hear a word like quadrupling, the federal investment in low-income students in America. That sounds like a lot. Well, you know what? We only invest about $15 billion a year in low-income students at the federal level right now. I'm talking about getting us to 60. And when you compare that to things that we do in the military and interstates that we build, it's not that big of a number. It honestly is not that big of a number, particularly when you think about what it saves. During the last recession, I'll be quick, but there was a law enforcement group that did the data and came up with a study that said, I'm the guy you paid later. He said, for every dollar you spend on pre-K now, you'll save $4 later in juvenile justice and welfare costs. So ultimately, this is a way to save money too, if we're willing to look beyond the immediate disaster that we're staring at right now.
Well, Republicans famously like to think long term in terms of power. Maybe they should think long term in terms of investment, too. Derek, really, really interesting conversation. I think we could talk for about an hour on this subject. I love it. Check out his book, Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy. I think now more than ever, we see that up close, what is at stake in terms of the infrastructure of our country, in terms of who we're investing in terms of how to protect our teachers who are at risk right now, who aren't being supplied with basic tools as it is. And now with a pandemic, they're in more of a crisis. So I really appreciate you joining us, Derek Black. Thanks for your work. And maybe, we'll have you back on to talk about what happens under a Biden administration.
Yeah. Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, guys, we will be back right after the break with our panel. We have Geovanny Alcibia, who's a DACA advocate and multimedia editor, and Napoleon the Legend is back. We're going to be talking about the day's news and how to think through the next 2 weeks, because there's just so much at stake here, as we just discussed. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. Okay, this is that time where you guys have to smash that like button. And if you're not subscribing, what are you doing? Why are you on our channel? We've got a show every day. We got to make this work. So make sure to click subscription, subscribe up there in the corner, and smash that like. And if you are generous and a real comrade and really believe that independent media is how we're going to get out of this mess, then put your money where your mouth is. Seriously, I spent $6 on a coffee today, and I will because it's my local coffee shop, and I love them, but $6, and I know like 3/4 that goes to rent. So if you could just like maybe throw in your nitro coffee that I just spent my money on, and you will get a subscription on Patreon. You'll become a patron, and you'll get all of the shows that we do for $5 in 1 month. We do 4 shows a week, plus you get an extra interview, plus you get an extra panel and special content. And if you're on long enough, you might even get like some swag or a mug. Join us at patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. That is how we build a show. And you guys are building it. All right. I'm excited. We have a first-time guest, and please, please, please tell me if I'm butchering your name. Geovanny Alcibia. Is that right? Did I get that? Good.
Oh, we can speak now? We cool?
Oh, you're good to speak, yeah. You are free. Geovanny is a DACA recipient. He's a multimedia editor. I will be looping back on what he commented on last week that really moved me. And Napoleon Legend is back. He is a hip-hop artist. He is a friend of the show. He's an activist. He is based in Brooklyn, and I say that because much love to Brooklyn. All right, guys, I want to start off, first topic, which was really shocking to me, given how much of the conversation is about turnout right now, and how if Democrats and folks who are going to vote for Biden, progressives, independents, Republicans, that it's all about turnout for them, and that is what is going to prevent Trump from really like tinkering with the election, including voter suppression. So that's why the way to fight his tactics of voter suppression is we turn out. So everything's like vote, 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 vote. That's all you see, right? Except Republicans are now seeing a bright spot in voter registration. This is a real issue. This is coming out of the AP. Quote, the Republican Party has cut into Democrats' advantage in voter registration tallies across some critical presidential battleground states, a fact they point to as evidence of steady and overlooked enthusiasm for Donald Trump and his party. Now, my hope is that there is a silent majority, including progressives who just like really are sucking it up and supporting Biden, or people that were just already registered to vote, because Democrats do have a registration advantage. I'm hoping that's it. But let's how about you, Napoleon? You're in a mecca of progressives. Do you feel this excitement in New York right now?
I mean, in my neighborhood, I'm a very in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. So there's a lot of Trump support around here that I could see. But I think it represents the whole of Brooklyn. Is just mostly a pocket in which I live.
Did you see them burn their masks?
No, that happened?
Oh yeah, there was a big in the Orthodox Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn, Williamsburg area in particular. There was a mask burning. Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay, that's kind of. I didn't even hear about that. I just know the COVID cases here are bad. It's like a red zone where I live. Yep. But I mean I don't really sense it. I mean I always thought the Republicans had already a set voting block, you know what I mean? That always so now seeing that there's a surge, it's a tad bit concerning. It's news to me. I wouldn't have thought that, if I didn't see that article right there. I really thought the surge was coming from Democrats or others, independents or whatever, want to vote Trump out. So all this means to me is that nothing is won, and we can't fall asleep at the wheel.
That's right. So Geovanny, you tweeted something out a few days ago, and it was talking about how you're a DACA recipient, and yes. And it got a lot of play, as it should, because this happened, just to set it up for why the timing of this tweet. Last week, the conversation shifted suddenly, where some progressives came out and were really questioning what was to be materially gained from voting for Biden. And I've heard everything from Biden's a fascist to Trump's not a fascist, and nothing is going to change. Now, I'm hoping that our audience can think a little bit more multidimensionally and strategically, and also understand at a human level that there are things that are at stake here, real things. Even if we go back to Obama era, right? You, Geovanny, are protected. So can you talk about, maybe we can put that tweet up on screen while you talk about what motivated you to tweet?
Well, I'm a DACA recipient, right? I'm obviously affected by Trump's policies, right? Trump took DACA to the Supreme Court. He failed. The funny thing is that the majority of the judges, seem to agree that DACA is unconstitutional. But the reason they voted against Trump was because I think Justice Roberts called the attempt capricious. Mm-hmm. So Trump failed based on incompetence, not because the Supreme Court justices necessarily disagree with him, right? So Trump failed that fight. The next thing that he does is he rescinds the DACA protections, right? Before, it's every 2 years that you have to renew it. Well, every year and a half, you have to renew it a couple months before it expires. You pay about $500 for the paperwork and you renew it. Then you...
that alone, I mean...
Yeah. Oh, wait, it gets better or worse. So now Trump rescinded DACA protections as opposed to 2 years. It's 1 year now. So we have to resubmit it seems bi-yearly now. So that's going to cost you about $1,000 a year, right, to resubmit. And it's something that people are not talking about. I think it's an obvious strategy to make it a financial burden, so people don't, apply every year or 2 years. So it's tough, right? It's going to be an economic hurdle, and Trump obviously wants to get rid of the program. Trump is obviously a racist fascist, right? So yes, like I said in a video that I made, yeah, Biden is a neoliberal corporatist, but he's not I'm trying not to curse. I'm sorry. But Biden is not a fascist. So already there, right? The material livelihood of close to 1 million DACA recipients is on the balance this election, as well as other minorities that are directly affected by Trump's policies.
And the political moment has shifted too. So not only are there a large group of people who are already underserved in all politics, right? Even in leftist spaces, even voices on shows, right? That's why I thought it was really important to have you on, because I feel like this just isn't part of the conversation in a very clear and personal way. So
you're right.
So not only is that a serious concern, but there's the immediate material concerns, but there's also this avenue where I truly believe, and I don't listen, the neoliberals have gone after me personally. I've gotten a lot of personal attacks against me, articles written against me, smears, right? I'm not friends with these people. So anybody who's calling me a hack, like, just do me a favor and look at my history, okay?
They called me a hack too, by the way.
Yeah, I think there's these people who, I'm very curious to see what kind of work they do. So even if that were the case, I do think, and Napoleon, like, I know you're thinking about this stuff strategically, Biden is not going to be able to get away with Obama policies that have now been proven false. We didn't know, we were not awake, or at least as a movement, large enough as a movement, to see that when Arne Duncan was pushing charter schools down our throats with the waiting for Superman propaganda, it was not going to turn out the way that and Betsy DeVos has proven that. And there are multiple other issues. Yes, neoliberalism paved the path for Trump, but Trump basically proved that neoliberalism is phony. And so now Biden won't have a choice but to actually reverse some Obama decisions. So, like, what do you think is going on the left right now? Why do you think folks are staging a fit 2 weeks before the election, telling folks not to vote?
I mean, I think I think there's some of it is like posturing to be like, yo, who's the most leftist, and it's that type of competition. And I mean, I don't want to get in people's head, but a part of it I think is a little bit immature. Some of them, they have a case, but my thing is, times, like you said, you made a great point. Times have changed. Like, the Obama years have nothing to do. We've lived through 4 years of Trump now. Like, that, people are awake now. People are politicized. People are radicalized right now. So there's going to be protests. There's going to be pressure. People weren't thinking about things like that. Even me, like, seeing Geovanny talk about his experience, I had no idea what it was like on a yearly basis. You got to shell out $500 and things like that. It makes things a lot more real to me when I hear the situations, because I don't have to deal with it. You know, even though I'm an immigrant, but I'm an American citizen now. But it's so important that, like, these inhumane, cruel policies they're just going to get worse. First off, if Trump becomes president, people such as Geovanny and millions of others are going to be affected by these things, and we have the opportunity to stop it, to lessen the suffering, and also to leverage our strength against Biden and Biden administration, and put pressure on them to really have more humane policies when it comes to immigration.
I'm of the belief that the movements won't let him ignore. At this stage of the movement, it's much stronger than it really has ever been. And even though Bernie lost, Bernie was not the movement. Bernie was a voice for a collective of movements. So one aspect, I think, and again, going back to Geovanny, your statement was so powerful and moved me, and I encourage others who are watching, listening to do the same. If your circumstances will be affected if Trump stays in office, it's not so much what we get from Biden, which I do think we can get some things out of, it's what we lose if Trump stays in office. And if we're not looking at this through a human lens, like what you were able to express, Geovanny, was what's on the line here is, like, think in terms of humanity, not in terms of philosophical debate. You're not in, as Noam Chomsky says so well, we're not in a seminar room. When the government is oppressing you, there's no room for debate over like a utopian art. I don't know. I mean, Geovanny, like, how has the response been? People are calling you a hack?
I've gotten many responses, right, on Facebook, on different groups. But something that I want to bring out is that something I brought up in a video is people that are supposed to be your allies, right, seem to be turning their backs on a lot of minorities, including me. I'll give you an example. For example, many content creators, Angie Speaks, right? She made a tweet one time that, if Trump wins, she's going to be having an orgasm, right? It's like, okay,
Whoa.
How does that work for me, right?
Is this a leftist? Supposed leftist?
Supposed leftist content creator.
I think we have to think about this, yeah.
Also, wait up though, Kyle Kulinski, he talked about how if he wants to be blamed if Biden loses this time. So I want them to acknowledge, yes, I am okay with Biden losing, and I'm okay with DACA recipients and other minorities being hurt by this as a political statement. So I want them to tell me that's the case. I don't want them to throw it around. Breonna Taylor, right? Did I say her name correct?
Breonna Joy Gray.
Breonna Joy Gray. She had this rhetoric with Noam Chomsky of, what are you going to be telling the working class person X, Y, and Z, right? So I would ask her, what would you be telling me as a DACA recipient to let Biden lose? So it's just sad, right? I was banned from Our Socialism for a day or two for making a post about, hey guys, should we not care about DACA recipients and other minorities being hurt by the Trump presidency? And I got banned.
You got banned from where?
Our Socialism on Reddit.
On Reddit, yeah.
So this just shows me, right, that there is we're not being heard, basically.
Well, it's also not Marxist. I mean, even Lenin advocated. I mean, as Piper Winkler is one of our team members on our show, she said even Lenin advocated for voting. And sure enough, I spent the weekend absorbed in reading some political biographies to remind us that we've been here in this moment before. And there is this erasure of, I think, another aspect of this, like, you mentioned Breonna, some of these people are really good friends of mine, and I deeply appreciate them, and most of their commentary I agree with. But what I really was confused about was she was saying, well, what about Black working class voters? Now, okay, I mean, I would love to talk to Black working class voters and see what they think right now, but also Black working class voters, the majority voted for Biden. So I don't know if that's the case that needs to be made. What do you think, Napoleon?
Yeah, I mean, like, it's important for these people. Like I said, I from what I know, I tend to agree with, like, Breonna. I tend to agree with a lot of what Kyle Kulinski stands for. But there's certain issues like that where you have to hold people with a large influence, with a large listenership to the fire when it comes to things like that. And somebody like Geovanny is a perfect case, because it's like, look, that might be funny, it might be a witty tweet, it might have a certain effect, and who knows, like, what was behind the intent behind the tweet or whatever that person was saying. But sometimes we forget about these realities because we're not facing them directly.
That's right.
And we have to be sensitive about everybody's plight, and people like Geovanny, all these groups need to come together, and it makes us stronger. So let's not alienate people for no reason, just for some sort of rhetorical battle or wins or little win or something like that. I think it's very important for us to be watchful of what we say and why. And that right there is a clear reason why we should really, like I said, once again, we should really get Trump out of there. And it's very important for us to get Trump out of there. It's crucial.
So one thing I like to say is I don't listen to commentators for my political advice. I try my hardest to go to the activists. If I want to know something, even as a reporter, but just also as like a voter and an activist and an organizer, if I want to inform folks about education, I talk to the education expert. If I want to inform folks about how lives are going to be materially affected, I go to folks who have come out and said their lives have been materially affected. I urge listeners to pay attention who is trying to influence your vote and why. There is an actual monetary, whether they're conscious of it or not. You know, Napoleon, you just hit on it. I'll say it as a host. There are a lot of segments we could do that could be clickbaity. There are a lot of segments that are going to drive up our subscriptions. There are a lot of segments that are going to go viral. But that, I don't think, is worth it when the stakes are so high in this election. As we said in the first segment in this panel, when Republicans' voter registration is up and we're worried about them suppressing the vote. It's just too sensitive right now. So if you are thinking about this and you really don't want to vote, fine. Okay, don't listen to me. Go listen to the organizers on the streets. Go listen to the DACA recipients. Go listen to the communities who are not saying to stay home. That's who I listen to, not folks whose livelihoods depend on clicks. And I'll leave it there.
And thank you for that, by the way.
Amen.
You know, listen, I may be getting a bunch of like Black Flag Twitter attacking me right now, but listen, I've been here before. In 2016, it was the same thing with Jill Stein. And, you know, and I urge the folks who have these platforms, instead of going on rants and have folks on.
And something I want to add is that we're losing so much time. I think you mentioned in a video with Sam Cedar how we could be using this time right now to organize in order to be a thorn in Biden's butt. See, I'm trying not to curse. So we're losing time. And Kyle Kulinski pulls out a video, I think, when the Breonna Joy Gray debacle came about, how it's a valid conversation. It's a valid debate. We're 3 weeks away from the election. We should be organizing right now.
2 weeks. Today. 2 weeks away from the election.
So we're 2 weeks away from the election and we're still having this conversation? What are you talking about? This is time we organize, right? To start, coming together to figure out how we're going to battle effectively a Biden administration. And it's just really upsetting, right?
Yeah. Well, this is. Go ahead.
Who's benefiting? Who's benefiting right now? What's the best course of action? And who are you trying? Whose agenda you're pushing right now? That's really the important thing right now. So, like what he said, we should be organized and doing what we do. It's one step at a time. The first step is making sure Biden is there. Second step, we go for Biden, and we attack. We leverage, we push on Biden. That's simple as that. I mean, what's the alternative strategy? I don't hear it. Doesn't make sense to me.
I don't want to focus too much on this in terms of the show in the next 2 weeks, but I did feel it deserved a space because on one hand, I think this is dividing the left at a moment when we should be unifying and talking about the human impact of Trump's policies and what policies we want to move forward that not only amend what destruction he's done, but make a more livable and just country. With that being said, folks who have platforms need to make the case very clear. And what is to be gained, like you said, Napoleon, like what do you get out of that? And what could you be doing with your time? And I think moving forward, we're going to be talking about what's at risk, what we need to do. We're going to have Joshua Kahn Russell on next week with you, Napoleon, to talk about the coup that is being organized potentially and how to fight that off. Because ultimately, I'm of the belief that if Trump stays in office, we're going to see a lot of leftist accounts shut down and monitored, and none of these conversations are going to even matter because we're not going to have an avenue and we're going to be like writing with invisible ink again. So, guys, I really appreciate you joining. Thanks to everybody for entertaining this conversation. These are tough conversations. I love our allies on the left, but we got to do better. We don't want to look back at history and say, what could we have done with our time? What could we have been done with our voices to make sure that the most vulnerable people in our community are supported?
And can I add something real quick?
Of course, please do.
I also feel that liberals have done a horrible, terrible job at appealing to leftism, right? As opposed to what you said, making this a human interest story, right? The material human implications based on empathy. Their strategy is just crap. Yeah. It's voter shaming, and I see so many videos of I imagine to be liberals, right, supporting Trump, and their strategy makes me cringe, right?
Wait, supporting Trump or
sorry, my apologies.
Biden.
Supporting Biden.
Right.
Supporting Biden, and their videos and their strategies make me cringe, and I want Biden to win. So that's when it's bad, right? Mm-hmm. So they also need to have a better strategy. To make matters worse, I believe it was announced today that Biden is going to be putting GOP members in his cabinet, right? This is the time right now where we should be out protesting
That's right.
his person. So we're really behind. Just the left is so fragmented by nature, it seems. So it's bad all around in my perspective. I wish things were better.
Jane McAlevy's been on the show before. She talks about union busting, and I do believe that there's a form of left busting happening. So stay focused, stay to the message, stay to the cause. Napoleon, you know this so well. You've seen this back. I mean, your father was an activist, right?
Yeah, he was part of a socialist party in the Comores Island, like in his younger days, and there was a lot of there was some plants. People discovered that they were playing for the other side, but people don't know that, had spies, did different things like that France was putting in to disrupt that socialist party who wasn't pro-French interest at the time. So then there was attempts on his life and things like that. So these are things that it's politics as usual. It happens. We have to keep our eyes focused on the prize, and really we have to, that's why, not to be meta, but I love shows like you, because you'll bring somebody like Geovanny on, like you said, and actually speak to the person instead of being on, trying to put yourself on a pedestal, like you're making. We have to give everybody a voice so people understand the stakes that are here at stake. I'm not a DACA recipient, but when I hear Geovanny, I'm like, oh damn, it should be in the forefront of my consciousness when I vote, and it was probably not before I heard his story. And these things are important to showcase these stories.
Absolutely. And that's what was so powerful about Bernie was, his rallies were not like traditional Democratic Party rallies, or even if they have those anymore, fundraisers, I should say. He had DACA recipients on. He had, people from the community, union workers who had been, lost their jobs, folks who had lost their housing, who were in housing justice. This was what made up the Bernie campaign. And we have to keep those stories near and close to our hearts and remember that this is what it's about. It's not a political game. So, as much as folks want to attack us saying voting is not going to give us the solutions needed, it's movements, it's both. And, when you're not thinking about the material interests of somebody and you're not showing up on the streets and you're just on Twitter, I'm not saying the voices on our media are there to disrupt. I think there's another thing happening there. But I do think that there are folks there who are there to divide and disrupt. And we have to stay focused, as you said, Napoleon. All right, guys, I truly appreciate Geovanny Guzman. I would love for you to come back on at some point if you're down for it. And
it would be my absolute pleasure. So
wonderful.
Of course. Thank you.
And Napoleon Legend, as always, thank you for joining, and we'll see you next week. And special shout-outs to the chat. Tico Todd, CRC, a solid show today with Derek, Geovanny, and Napoleon. Gracias, Nomiki. Thank you. Thank you so much for your support. And Duke of Bread, quote, official Antifa code name equals Comrade Nemo the Bearer of Keys. Nemo Key for short. This is an ongoing joke that goes on the Majority Report because Sam Cedar, host of Majority Report, cannot get my name. He got close today. People are coming up with mnemonic devices. It's very clever. We need shirt. We should just have a series of shirts and mugs and stickers with all the pronunciations of my name. Duke of Bread. That was Duke of Bread. Thank you so much. And of course, Professor Harvey K, who's in the live chat. And thank you, MIDI doctors, for working the algorithms. Yes, I don't understand that, but you guys do, and I'm really appreciative of it. And special thanks to Bob the Mod and everyone in the live chat. Oh, wait, one more. Tico Todd, thank you so much again. I guess it was another For the first YouTube super chat. I'm not watching the chat, so I'm getting little updates as we go. And Raul Ventura, thank you very, very much. All right, guys, we're going to show Geovanny's video before we run out of the show so you can see his plea. And I urge you all, if you can move 3 people into understanding what's at stake, I'm not a voter shamer, okay? Like, that's another jam. That's something that the liberals are doing. This is about how do we move people into understanding what's at stake. So if you can take even his story or someone else's story that would be personally impacted, their lives be personally impacted, please try to move 3 voters if you can on the left, center, wherever. Just try to move some voters if you can. On that note, we will see you tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern on the Nomiki Show. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you. White House announced that they're winding down on DACA protections. So imagine yourself in my situation, a lefty, and people that are supposed to be your allies are writing this type of shit. This comes from a lefty content creator who goes by the name of Angie Speaks. She wrote in a tweet, "Seeing Radlip simping over Biden guarantees that I'm going to come when Trump wins. Do you know who will not be having an orgasm if Trump wins again? DACA recipients." Just a thought. And actually other minorities, for that matter. White House announced that they're winding down on DACA protections. So imagine yourself in my situation, a lefty, and people that are supposed to be your allies are writing this type of shit. This comes from a lefty content creator who goes by the name of Angie Speaks. She wrote in a tweet, "Seeing Radlip simping over Biden guarantees that I'm going to come when Trump wins. Do you know who will not be having an orgasm if Trump wins again? DACA recipients." Just a thought. And actually other minorities, for that matter.